Under a church in the middle of Vienna, in a vault that an emperor built to hold his own family, sits a pewter coffin with a lid cut at an angle so steep it looks like a mistake. Everything around it is rounded and heavy and baroque, the way you'd expect. This one rises to a hard ridge, almost like the roof of a house, and along the length of that ridge, somebody laid a crucifix. Near the foot, underneath the cross, a skull sits on a pair of crossed bones. On the side there's a monogram in 4 letters, worn down but still legible if you know what you're looking at. The woman inside was 23 years old. The inscription on the box calls her illustrious in 4 things: her birth, her marriage, her childbearing, her death. Somebody in 1692 thought that was a compliment, and I'm sure it was meant as one. Standing in front of it now, with what we know about what actually happened to her, it lands more like a coroner's summary. Every single one of those 4 things is a wound. Her name was Maria Antonia, Archduchess of Austria, Electress of Bavaria, granddaughter of a king of Spain, daughter of a Holy Roman Emperor, and for 19 years of a very short life, the legal heiress to the largest empire on the face of the planet. She was also, according to the geneticists who have spent the last 2 decades running numbers on her family, the single most inbred person the House of Habsburg ever produced. Not Charles II of Spain, the one everybody has heard of, the one with the jaw and the seizures and the exorcists and the famous autopsy. Her. She beats him. And she beats him by a distance that surprised the researchers who found it, and almost nobody knows her name. Before we get properly into this, welcome in. Thank you for being here, and if this is your first time on the channel, thanks for taking a chance on a long one. Do me a favor and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from, because that section is honestly one of my favorite parts of doing this. And a real, proper thank you to everybody over on Patreon and to the YouTube channel members who keep this thing running. The links to support the channel are down in the description and also up in the pinned comment if you want to come aboard. So, the blood. Everything downstream of this starts there. Here's how the measurement works, and I'll keep it clean. Geneticists use something called the coefficient of inbreeding, and it answers exactly one question. If you reach into a person's genome and pull out any gene at random, what are the odds that the 2 copies of it, the one from the mother and the one from the father, are physically descended from the same single ancestor? 2 unrelated people produce children where that number is effectively 0. First cousins produce children at around 0.06. A brother and sister, or a parent and a child, produce offspring at 0.25. 1 gene in 4. Charles II of Spain, the last Habsburg king of Spain, comes out at 0.2538, slightly worse than a full sibling pairing. Maria Antonia comes out at 0.3053. Those numbers come from a research team at the University of Santiago de Compostela in Galicia, who did something enormous. Gonzalo Alvarez, Francisco Ceballos, Kelsa Quintero. They reconstructed the Habsburg family tree backwards through 16 generations and more than 3,000 individuals, cross-checked against parish records and dynastic genealogies, and then ran the whole thing through the standard population genetics calculations. First big paper in 2009 in the journal PLOS1. with the wonderfully blunt title, The Role of Inbreeding in the Extinction of a European Royal Dynasty. A follow-up in 2013, in Heredity, which went wider and looked at the whole family rather than just the Spanish branch. When they got to Maria Antonia, they flagged her by name, highest coefficient found anywhere in the dynasty, higher than any emperor, higher than any king, higher than the man whose skull became the punchline of European history. What does a number like that actually do inside a living body? Every single one of us is walking around carrying a handful of broken genes. Recessive ones, mostly. They sit there harmlessly for an entire lifetime because you've got a working copy on the matching chromosome that quietly covers for the damage. You never find out they're in there. Your children never find out. The system only breaks when both copies are broken at the same time, and the one reliable way to get both copies broken at the same time is for both of them to arrive from the same source. Marry your uncle, and a large slice of your child's genome is being handed over twice from the same small stock. The broken ones locate each other. Whatever has been hiding in the family for generations finally comes out into the daylight. Maria Antonia's parents were an uncle and his niece. Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor, married Margaret Theresa of Spain, who was his sister's daughter, and then, to make the whole thing properly claustrophobic, Margaret Theresa's own parents had also been an uncle and his niece. Philip IV of Spain married Mariana of Austria, who was his sister's child. Consecutive generations, same knot, pulled tighter each time. Go further back, and it keeps happening. Ferdinand III married Maria Anna of Spain, and they were first cousins. Philip III married Margaret of Austria, cousins again. Maximilian II married Maria of Austria, first cousins. The pattern is not occasional, it's structural. It is how this family reproduced itself for the better part of 200 years. From the early 1500s right through to the end. The technical term for what this produces is pedigree collapse, and the phrase is doing a lot of polite work. You're supposed to have 8 great-grandparents, 16 above them, 32 above that, 64, 128, doubling every generation you climb, out and out until the numbers get so large that essentially everyone alive in a given region ends up somewhere in your tree. In this family, the numbers stop doubling. They start folding inward. Maria Antonia's mother had 10 great-great-grandparents where there should have been 16. Trace Maria Antonia's own ancestry upward, and the same names keep appearing in slots where different names ought to be, sometimes twice in the same generation, sometimes as both a grandparent and a great-grandparent simultaneously. One of the researchers described the diagram as looking less like a tree and more like a circle, and once you've seen it drawn out properly, you cannot unsee that. The lines come back around and rejoin themselves. Now, they knew. People always assume they didn't. The Catholic Church required formal dispensations for marriages within the forbidden degrees of kinship, and the Habsburgs applied for them constantly and received them constantly, because a pope who wanted Habsburg armies standing between the Ottoman Empire and Rome was not going to blow that relationship over a technicality about consanguinity. Village priests across Europe warned their parishioners against marrying too close. Folk wisdom in half a dozen countries already carried the idea that blood too near itself made weak children, sickly children, children who didn't live. Nobody in 1669 had a concept of a recessive allele, but the general notion that this was risky had been in the air for centuries before any laboratory confirmed it. They did it anyway, and they did it for a reason that is completely coherent once you accept their premises. An inheritance that leaves the bloodline is an inheritance lost forever. Marry your daughter to a stranger, and in 2 generations, your territories belong to somebody else's family. Marry her to her cousin or her uncle, and everything stays inside the house. Spain and Austria had split into 2 branches in the 1500s, and the entire policy of both branches after that was to keep stitching the 2 halves back together with marriages. Every uncle-niece match was a stitch. They were trading the health of their children for the integrity of a map, and they knew they were making a trade. They just thought the map was worth more. You can see the bill arriving in the mortality figures, and the mortality figures are hard to look at. The Santiago team assembled 71 Habsburg families, 502 pregnancies, running from around the middle of the 15th century through to the end of the 18th. 93 of those babies died in infancy. Another 76 died in childhood. 333 made it to the age of 10, survivable on its own terms, right up until you set it against the population they ruled over. In Spanish villages of the same period, roughly 80% of babies made it past their first birthday. In this family, it was about half. Sit with that comparison a moment. It runs completely upside down. These were the wealthiest, warmest, best fed, best doctored, most physically protected children anywhere in Europe. Wet nurses selected and inspected. Physicians on permanent retainer, palaces with heated rooms and clean water, and no livestock in the sleeping quarters. And they were dying at roughly twice the rate of a Castilian farmer's baby sleeping 3 feet from a goat. The 2013 study turned up something else, split the data by period, and the shape of the dying changes. In the earlier centuries, most of the death was happening in childhood, after the first year. In the later centuries, most of it had moved into infancy, into the first 12 months. The researchers raised the possibility of purging, which in this context means something bleak. The most lethal recessive combinations were being weeded out over time simply because the children carrying them died before reproducing. A family clearing its own genetic debt by burying enough babies. Behind those percentages are actual nurseries. Take Philip IV, Maria Antonia's grandfather, who managed the family's worst measured jaw and one of its more catastrophic reproductive records. Between his 2 marriages, he fathered at least 13 legitimate children. 2 of them outlived him by any meaningful margin. His first wife, Elizabeth of France, was pregnant 8 times and buried most of the results. His son, Balthazar Charles, the heir, the boy everybody had pinned the future on, painted by Velázquez on a pony looking exactly like a country's hope, died at 16 of what was probably smallpox after being bled repeatedly by his physicians. Philip was reportedly never the same man afterwards. Or take Leopold himself. 16 children across 3 marriages. He buried a majority of them, most before they were old enough to speak in sentences. He had a daughter by his second wife who lived a few months, another who lived a couple of years. By his third wife, he had children who died at 1, at 2, at 4. He attended those funerals over and over across a 30-year span in the same building, and his diaries record the same phrase turning up each time: some version of God's will be done, written down by a man who by then must have been writing it out of pure muscle memory. The physical setting was working against them as well. A 17th century royal nursery was actively hostile to infant survival in ways nobody involved suspected. Babies were swaddled tightly, wound in bandages from shoulder to foot so the limbs could not move, on the theory that unrestrained movement would deform the growing body. Swaddled infants were left bound for hours, sometimes changed only 2 or 3 times a day, which meant lying in their own filth for long stretches in cloth pressed against the skin. Rickets was rampant among children who never saw sun. Rooms were kept shuttered and hot for the same reason birth chambers were. Wet nurses were selected on social criteria as much as medical ones, and a nurse carrying an infection passed it directly to the child at the breast. And on top of every one of those environmental hazards, sitting underneath it, was the genetic loading. A baby with a compromised immune system, or a heart defect, or a kidney malformation, or a metabolic disorder nobody could name, going into an environment that would have challenged a robust child. Alvarez and his team put the two together explicitly. Some of the deaths in that dataset are the century: plague, smallpox, dysentery, the ordinary carnage that took children out of every household in Europe. But when you compare like against like, the same century, the same diseases, the same city, and the wealthy inbred family is dying at twice the rate of the poor outbred one, the difference has to be coming from somewhere. It was coming from inside the pedigree. The other thing this family gave the world is the most instantly recognizable face in European history. It was a real physical condition, and it did real damage, and the damage is where I'd rather put the attention than the silhouette. In 2019, a team, again out of Santiago, ran a study that I think is one of the more elegant pieces of historical genetics anybody has done. They took 66 portraits of 15 Habsburgs and handed them to 10 maxillofacial surgeons. Working blind, without knowing which subject was which or how the family related, those surgeons scored each face against 18 separate anatomical markers. 11 of them relate to mandibular prognathism, where the lower jaw pushes forward past the upper. The other 7 relate to maxillary deficiency, where the middle of the face is underdeveloped and flat, and the nose ends up with that characteristic hooked prominence. Then the researchers plotted the surgeons' scores against the inbreeding coefficients they'd already calculated. The relationship held. Around 1/5 of the variation in how severe the jaw was could be predicted purely from how inbred the individual happened to be. The senior author on the paper, Roman Vilas, put it plainly when the study came out. They had shown for the first time a clear positive relationship between inbreeding and the appearance of the Habsburg jaw. The single most extreme case in the whole sample was Philip IV of Spain, king from 1621, and Maria Antonia's own grandfather. The mildest case was Mary of Burgundy, who married into the family in 1477, right at the beginning, before any of the folding started. What that deformity does to somebody who has to live inside it, the portraits are specifically designed not to show you. When the lower teeth sit well forward of the upper teeth, the molars never meet. Nothing grinds. Food goes down in whole pieces. The tongue, sitting in a mouth built to the wrong dimensions, ends up too large for the palate, which interferes with speech and with swallowing. And in the worst presentations, the lips cannot close at all. So the mouth stays open permanently. Saliva runs continuously, and there is nothing the person can do about it. Eating becomes slow and effortful. And at a Spanish court dinner where 60 silent courtiers are watching every mouthful under formal etiquette that forbade almost all movement, publicly humiliating. Charles II reportedly could not chew at all and swallowed his food in lumps, which ruined his digestion for his entire life and probably contributed to how thin he stayed. Foreign ambassadors wrote home about the drooling. They wrote about it constantly, in 3 or 4 languages, over decades, because these men were being paid specifically to notice weakness in the Spanish monarchy, and here was weakness you could see from across a room. So here is the strangest single fact in this entire story. Maria Antonia, with the highest inbreeding coefficient ever measured in this family, does not appear anywhere in the record with any of that. She had the Habsburg face, or something of it, in the way that most of them did. Nobody described her as deformed. No ambassador wrote home about an archduchess who could not chew or could not stand or could not be understood when she spoke. Her body worked. She walked and rode and danced and held conversations in several languages. Her father, who was an accomplished composer as well as an emperor, brought her directly into the musical life of the Viennese court, and she seems to have thrived in it. You're entitled to be suspicious of the portraits, and you should be, because court portraiture is propaganda, and every painter in Europe knew how to soften a jawline when a marriage negotiation depended on it. But you cannot paint away a child who cannot sit up straight. Ambassadors would have said something. Ambassadors always said something. Their entire job was saying something. So the dice, on the surface, came up clean for her. The one Habsburg who by the numbers should have been the most damaged human being in the family walked out of the nursery apparently intact. What she got instead was every single thing that killed the women in her family, and that turns out to be more than enough to be going on with. Her mother's story starts in Madrid, and it starts with a painting you have almost certainly seen without knowing you were looking at anybody relevant. Margaret Theresa was born on the 12th of July, 1651, in the Royal Alcázar in Madrid. The Alcázar was an enormous, gloomy, half-medieval fortress palace that burned to the ground in the following century, taking a substantial chunk of the Spanish royal art collection with it, and by all descriptions, it was an oppressive place to live. Dark corridors, cold stone, rooms hung with black. Spanish court ceremonial was the most rigid in Europe, and the Alcázar was where it was performed most rigidly. Her father was Philip IV, King of Spain, ruler of an empire that ran from the Netherlands to the Philippines by way of the entire American continent, and which was quietly and comprehensively going bankrupt. Her mother was Mariana of Austria, who was Philip's own niece, 30 years his junior, and who had originally been engaged to Philip's son. The son died. The old king simply took the fiancée for himself rather than let the Austrian connection slip. One move, and it lays out exactly how these people thought about the women in their own households. A girl was a claim with a face attached, and if the claim needed moving, the girl went where the claim went. 5 years after she was born, Diego Velázquez painted her. You know the picture, even if you don't know you know it. A dim, high-ceilinged room in the palace, with a doorway of light at the back and a man standing in it. A small blonde girl in the center, 5 years old, standing absolutely still in a wide farthingale that pushes her arms out from her sides like she's balancing on a wire. 2 maids of honor bending toward her, one offering something on a small tray. A dog stretched out in the foreground and a court dwarf beside it. And Velázquez himself off to the left, brush in hand, behind a canvas so large we never see what's on it, looking directly out at whoever is standing where we're standing. That child in the middle is Margaret Theresa. She is Maria Antonia's mother, and she has about 18 years left. Velázquez painted her repeatedly over the next few years, and the reason was not sentimental. Those canvases were shipping documents. In Vienna, her uncle Leopold was waiting to marry her. He had been promised her while she was still small enough to be carried, and the portraits went north across the Alps at intervals precisely so that the man who was eventually going to take her body could confirm from a distance that the goods were developing on schedule. The one in the peach dress, around 1653. The one in the blue dress, 1659, probably the most famous single image of her after Las Meninas. Each one crated and carted over the mountains to Austria, so a bridegroom 15 years older, who was also her mother's brother, could keep an eye on how she was coming along. You can tell that story warmly if you want. Long-distance engagement, letters, portraits arriving, a girl growing up knowing exactly where her future lay. Leopold called her Gretel, a Viennese diminutive that comes across as genuinely affectionate. She called him uncle, which he was. For her 17th birthday, he collaborated with the composer Antonio Cesti on an opera staged in her honor, and Leopold wrote some of the music himself. He was that sort of man. Awkward, devout, deeply serious, and privately a rather good musician. I don't think the affection was fake. I think it was probably the most real thing in the arrangement. But she was 12 at the formal betrothal in 1663. 15 at the marriage, pregnant within weeks, dead at 21. Whatever tenderness existed inside that machine, and I think some genuinely did, the machine was going to grind her into powder regardless of how the two of them felt about each other. The politics behind the match are the whole reason her daughter's life goes the way it goes. Philip IV had 2 surviving daughters by his 2 marriages. The elder was Maria Theresa from his first wife, and she had been married off to Louis XIV of France in 1660 as part of a peace settlement. As a condition of that marriage, she formally renounced every claim she had to the Spanish throne. In exchange, Spain was to pay France a dowry of 500,000 gold crowns. Spain never paid it, not 1 crown. The treasury was empty and the money simply never appeared, and from the French point of view that meant the contract had failed and the renunciation was void. Louis XIV spent the following 4 decades pointing this out to anybody who would listen, and quite a few people who wouldn't. That left Margaret Theresa, and when Philip IV sat down to write his will in 1665, dying, he made the order explicit. The throne goes to his son Charles. If Charles leaves no children, it comes to Margaret Theresa and her descendants. The French line is behind them. He put it in writing precisely because he could see the fight coming. Charles was 4 years old when his father died. He could not walk. He could not speak. He was still being breastfed, and every embassy in Madrid was already writing home with the assessment that this boy was never going to father a child. So Margaret Theresa left for Vienna in 1666, carrying in her person the reversion of the Spanish Empire. The journey took months. She went with a Spanish household, Spanish servants, Spanish confessors, Spanish furniture and Spanish habits, and she was expected to keep all of it because a Spanish infanta at a foreign court was supposed to remain conspicuously Spanish. They married her in Vienna in December of 1666. She was 15 years and 5 months old. Vienna, when she got there, was a smaller and rougher city than Madrid, and the Habsburg court in Austria was less rigid and less rich than the one she had grown up inside. She kept her Spanish household around her like a shell. Spanish attendants, Spanish confessors, Spanish food where it could be managed, Spanish dress. Her ladies wore the guardenfante, that enormous cage-like hooped skirt you can see in the Velázquez portraits at a court where nobody else did, and the Viennese found it faintly ridiculous. The wedding celebrations were spectacular and expensive and went on for over a year. The centerpiece was Antonio Cesti's Il Pomodoro, staged in a purpose-built wooden theatre put up specifically for it, with machinery for flying gods and collapsing mountains and a naval battle, and it is generally considered one of the most lavish operatic productions of the entire century. Leopold contributed music to it himself. It ran for 2 days. An enormous amount of money and effort went into welcoming that 15-year-old, and I don't think any of it was cynical. Leopold seems to have been delighted with her. The letters from foreign observers describe a young empress who was cheerful, who liked to dance, who was fond of her husband in a straightforwardly girlish way, and who got on well enough with the court once they got used to the skirts. She also, and this is documented, disliked her stepmother-in-law and had a temper about precedence and could be quite sharp with people she felt had slighted her Spanish dignity, an actual personality surfacing through the ceremonial varnish, and I find that oddly reassuring. Here is what happened to her body over the following 6 years, as a straight list. The list does the work on its own. 28th of September, 1667. A son, Ferdinand Wenceslaus. He lives 15 weeks. Dead on the 13th of January, 1668. 18th of January, 1669. A daughter, Maria Antonia. This one lives. 20th of February, 1670. A son, John Leopold. Born and dead the same day. The records do not tell us whether he ever drew breath or whether they baptized him in whatever minutes they had. 9th of February, 1672. A daughter, Maria Anna Antonia. Dead on the 23rd of the same month, 14 days old. 2 miscarriages somewhere in the gaps, dates not preserved, which in practice means 2 separate episodes of blood and pain, and a physician being summoned in the night, and nobody bothering to record it, because a miscarried Habsburg was not yet a person, and therefore not yet an event. 6 pregnancies in 6 years. She married at 15, and by the time she was 21, her body had been continuously either pregnant or recovering for essentially the whole span, and she kept getting up. Out of everything in the contemporary accounts, that detail is the one I find hardest to put down. She was noted for rising and walking about the rooms very soon after each delivery, and the reason recorded for it was that it pleased her husband. In the 17th century, a noblewoman was supposed to lie in for weeks after giving birth, in a darkened, sealed room, sometimes a full month or more, specifically so that the body could close itself back up. Margaret Theresa was up and moving in order to be a good wife, with a uterus that hadn't finished contracting down and a raw wound on the inside of her roughly the diameter of a dinner plate where the placenta had torn away. By the early weeks of 1673, she was pregnant for the 7th time, about 4 months along. Then a fever came, and it ran for around 8 days. The accounts describe something settling in her chest. Bronchitis is where most of the modern summaries land, working from Andrew Wheatcroft's account of the family and from the Capuchin crypt's own institutional records. A woman of 21 whose body had been emptied out 6 times over, carrying a 7th, with an infection in her lungs, in a century that had nothing whatsoever that could touch it. What they would have done to her is worse than the illness in some respects, and it's worth being specific about the treatment rather than waving at it. They would have bled her. Fever meant an excess of blood in the humoral system, so you opened a vein and let some out, usually in the arm, sometimes at the ankle, and you did it repeatedly across the course of the illness. 12 ounces at a time was standard, sometimes more, on a woman who was already anemic from 6 pregnancies, already septic, already carrying a fetus that needed oxygen. Removing the red cells that were doing the carrying is close to the worst available intervention. They would have purged her, emetics to make her vomit, clysters administered from below, the whole idea being to drive corrupted matter out of the body through whatever exit was nearest. So on top of an 8-day fever and a 4-month pregnancy and total exhaustion, add continuous vomiting and diarrhea and a physician arriving every day or two to open her arm again and catch the blood in a bowl. Blistering was on the menu too. Caustics applied to the skin to raise deliberate sores, on the reasoning that the corruption would drain out through them. So burns on purpose on a dying woman. She died on the 12th of March, 1673, in the Hofburg. The crypt's own record of her death contains one line I've not been able to shake. She was talking, right up to the end. The German phrasing preserved in the account says she went on speaking until the very last quarter of an hour. Her husband was holding her hand while she did it. Leopold wrote afterwards in his private diary that his heart was breaking, and then immediately, in the same breath, that God's will be done. He was an oppressively pious man, and I suspect both halves of that sentence were completely sincere at once. Years later, he still referred to her as his only Margareta, a strange thing to say about a first wife when you've since married twice more. And I don't think he meant it as a slight against the others. I think he meant it precisely how it sounds. Then they opened her up. Habsburg bodies were autopsied and embalmed as standard practice, and in her case the examination produced information the family had not had while she was alive. The child she had been carrying, 4 months along, was a boy. A boy. After Ferdinand Wenceslaus and John Leopold had both gone into the ground before their first birthdays, after 6 years of continuous attempts. The single thing the entire arrangement existed to produce, found in the opened abdomen of a 21-year-old on a table, they kept him with her. The inscription cut into her sarcophagus counts through the pregnancies and refers to a 5th child still warmed in the mother's womb. So when they sealed her into the pewter, the son went in with her, and both of them are still down there together in the Capuchin vault, in a box carrying a Latin line saying she lived most innocently 21 years and 8 months, ruled most piously 6 years and 4 months, and died most devoutly on the 12th of March. The sarcophagus itself was made by a court pewterer who signed it, and I like that detail more than I probably should. Loth, Somme, Aulich pewterer, made this, 1673. A tradesman putting his name on a box containing a queen and her unborn son. Maria Antonia was 4 years old when this happened. I've thought a lot about what a 4-year-old actually registers of an event like that. Not the politics, obviously, but the change in the household would have been total. Habsburg court mourning was thorough and lengthy and physical. Black cloth over the furniture, black hangings on the walls, the entire court in black clothing for months on end. No music, which in Leopold's Vienna meant switching off the single loudest and most constant feature of daily life. No hunting, no dancing, no theatre. A small girl would have spent a year in a house where nothing made any noise. And on some level she would already have understood that she was the last one. Her older brother had died before she was born. Her younger brother and younger sister had both been born and buried within her own memory. 4 births in 6 years, and she was the only one left standing at the end of it. That is the position she holds from the age of 4 onwards. Sole survivor of a marriage constructed specifically to make a dynasty, and, from the 12th of March 1673, the legal heiress to the Spanish Empire. The Spanish part of her position is difficult to overstate. Most tellings of the War of the Spanish Succession skip her entirely and jump straight from Charles II to the 2 rival princes, and she is sitting in the middle of the whole thing for 2 decades without getting named once. Under Castilian law, women could inherit. Not preferred, but permitted, and the rules of proximity to the last holder mattered more than sex did. Charles II had no children. Everybody in Europe could see he was never going to have any. His elder sister's claim had been signed away, though the French disputed the signature and had a decent argument for disputing it. His younger sister, Margaret Theresa, was dead, which put her surviving child, a small girl in Vienna, at the front of the queue. And Madrid behaved exactly as though that were true, and their behavior is the remarkable thing here. Her birthday, the 18th of January, was declared a national celebration across Spain by the Queen Regent, her grandmother Mariana. Not a court observance, a national one. Theatrical productions were mounted in Madrid every single year to mark it, and it went on for the entire span of her life. Her first birthday in 1670 was celebrated with a Calderon spectacle, Fieras a Femina Amor, staged at enormous expense. That level of honor was reserved for kings, for queens, and for infantas born on Spanish soil. She was none of those things. She was a child in Austria who never in her life set foot in Spain, and an entire empire stopped work once a year for her birthday. Charles II wrote to her personally in his own hand, which was an unusual courtesy from a man whose correspondence was almost entirely produced by secretaries. The Council of State deliberated over how she should be addressed and settled on the forms that had been used for the Infanta Isabella Clara Eugenia a century earlier. The Spanish government was, in writing in its own archives, treating her as the heir. In 1676, they went considerably further. Negotiators drew up a complete marriage contract between Charles II and Maria Antonia. It was signed at San Lorenzo on the 15th of October, 1676. And the original sites in the National Historical Archive in Madrid. She was 7 years old. The document laid out that if Charles died childless, she would be universal heiress to the entire monarchy. Uncle and niece again. Same pattern. One more turn of the screw. Nobody involved thought it was unusual. That marriage never took place. Charles married Marie-Louise of Orléans instead, in 1679, for French political reasons that fell apart almost immediately and produced no children and made everybody involved miserable. But the 7-year-old girl in Vienna with a signed contract sitting in a Spanish archive did not go anywhere, and neither did her claim. Charles gets a section of his own here. The whole crisis exists because of him, and his body is the single loudest piece of evidence about what this family had done to itself. Charles II was born on the 6th of November 1661. He was Margaret Theresa's full brother, so Maria Antonia's uncle on the Spanish side, and he was the last Habsburg to rule Spain. Coefficient of 0.2538. Endpoint of a line that had been marrying uncles to nieces and cousins to cousins for close to 2 centuries. He did not walk until he was somewhere between 4 and 8, depending on which account you trust. He was not weaned until nearly 4 years old. His head was, by numerous descriptions, disproportionately large for his frame, and he had a pronounced weakness on one side. The jaw was severe enough that his mouth would not close, so he could not grind food and swallowed it in pieces, which caused him digestive misery for his entire life. He drooled continuously, and every foreign observer who got within 20 feet of him mentioned it. His speech was hard to follow. He had seizures. He was intermittently unable to stand without support. He had a chronic condition affecting his kidneys, and on the evidence of the later examination of his body, malformed genitals. He was also nobody's idiot, and that gets lost constantly. His education was neglected deliberately in his early years, while his mother governed in his name and had no particular incentive to produce a competent adult king. By the time anybody made a serious attempt to instruct him properly, the window had partly shut. But the surviving letters and the accounts of his final decade show a man with an uncomfortably precise understanding of his own situation. He knew he was dying childless. He knew what was going to happen to Spain the moment he did. He spent years trying to construct an inheritance that wouldn't get his country cut into pieces by foreigners. And he kept arriving at the same answer, which we'll come to. Spain, meanwhile, had decided that its king was bewitched, not as a figure of speech, literally. The Spanish court concluded that Charles II's condition was the product of sorcery worked on him by an enemy, and the nickname attached itself permanently, El Hechizado, the Bewitched. What follows from that belief is one of the more disturbing episodes in early modern royal medicine, and it was happening to Maria Antonia's uncle during her adult life, while her own son was being positioned to inherit from him. Exorcists were brought into the palace to work on the king's body. His confessor, a Dominican named Froilan Diaz, opened a formal investigation into who had enchanted him and how. The method involved a convent up in the Asturias, where a number of nuns were understood to be possessed. The procedure was to have an exorcist interrogate the demons inside those nuns about the spell laid on the King of Spain. Answers came back. Names were named. An entire apparatus of accusation and counter-accusation grew up around the question, and it eventually consumed the careers of several senior churchmen, including Diaz himself. The physical treatments ran alongside all of that, bleeding constantly for decades, purges, relics laid directly on his body, including the actual corpses of saints brought into his bedchamber and pressed against him in the hope of a cure. He was made to sleep beside the exhumed body of a holy man on more than one occasion. And then there are the pigeons, freshly killed birds, split open, still warm, pressed against his head, so that the vapors could enter his skull and restore the balance of his humors. Steaming birds on the head of the King of Spain, in the Alcázar, in front of his physicians, several times. None of it worked. Nothing was ever going to work. He was carrying a genome that had been folded in on itself for 200 years, and no quantity of prayer or blood or poultry was going to unfold it. His 2 marriages run alongside Maria Antonia's entire adult life, and they show the pressure the whole system was under. Marie-Louise of Orléans came to Spain in 1679. She was Louis XIV's niece, 19 years old, French, lively, and completely unprepared for what Madrid was going to do to her. Spanish court ceremonials swallowed her. She was not permitted to go out unaccompanied, not permitted to ride the way she had in France, and her French attendants were sent home within months and replaced with Spanish ones who reported on her. There's a story, possibly polished in the retelling, about her parrots being confiscated because they spoke French. Charles was reportedly devoted to her, and the accounts of that seem sincere. She, by every surviving letter, was miserable, and the one thing she was there to do, she could not do. No children came. 10 years, no pregnancy that anybody recorded. The pressure on her was relentless, and it came from every direction. The court blamed her. Physicians dosed her with fertility remedies that were, at best, useless. Some of the treatments prescribed to Spanish queens in this period involved substances we would now recognize as poisons. She died in February of 1689, aged 26, after a short illness that began with abdominal pain and vomiting following a ride. The official cause was given as appendicitis or a similar abdominal crisis. Half of Europe immediately said she had been poisoned, with the usual candidates being the Austrian faction at court who wanted a German queen, or the French, or somebody's cook. Nobody proved anything then, and nobody has since, and a burst appendix in 1689 looks exactly like poisoning to an observer with no other framework available. Charles remarried within months to Maria Anna of Neuburg, who was the sister of Maria Antonia's own stepmother. Also no children, also blamed. The second queen turned out to be considerably harder and more political than the first, and spent the following decade fighting for control of a dying man's will, a long and unpleasant story of its own. Both queens were installed to solve a problem that could not be solved by any woman, because the problem was never with the women. And both of them were held responsible for the failure anyway, in public, for years. He died on the 1st of November, 1700, aged 38, and they opened him on a table the way they opened all of them. The description that comes down to us from that examination is famous, and it reaches us through a number of hands. In the widely circulated account, popularized in modern times largely through the Spanish physician and writer Pedro Gargantilla, the body was found to contain not a single drop of blood. The heart was described as being the size of a peppercorn. The lungs corroded, the intestines rotten and gangrenous, a single testicle, black as coal, the head full of water. Some of that language is clearly the vocabulary of a horrified man rather than the vocabulary of a clinical protocol. A heart the size of a peppercorn is not anatomically possible in a living adult, so somebody in the chain was reaching for an image rather than a measurement. On the other hand, the body of a man dead of a long, wasting illness would in fact be pale and drained, and to a 17th century surgeon opening a chest that presented as bloodless, that description is not unreasonable. Later urological work going back over the descriptions has interpreted the genital findings as posterior hypospadias with one atrophied testicle, a real and specific heritable condition that fits the rest of the evidence rather neatly. Whether the peppercorn line originated in the original protocol, in a shaken assistance account, or in somebody a century later improving the story in the retelling, I honestly don't know, and I don't think anybody does. What I do know is that when they cut open the last Habsburg king of Spain, the men standing around that table were sufficiently appalled by the contents that the language they used has survived 300 years and travelled into every language in Europe. Draw from that what you want to draw. Back to Vienna and back to the girl. While all of that was gathering in Madrid, her position at home had been quietly falling apart. Leopold remarried fast. His wife died in March of 1673, and by October he was married again to Claudia Felicitas of Austria. 7 months. It comes across as callous, and I don't think it was personal. An emperor without a son is a standing crisis, and he was 33 with exactly one surviving child, and that child was a girl. Claudia Felicitas gave him 2 daughters. Both died in infancy. Then she died herself of tuberculosis in April of 1676. She was 22 years old. 3 years of marriage, 2 dead babies, and a young woman coughing her lungs apart in the same set of rooms where the previous wife had died. 2 dead empresses in 3 years, both in their early 20s, both worn out by the same job. Leopold married again that December. Eleanor Magdalene of Neuburg, who was healthy, who came from a large and famously fertile German family, and who delivered on every count. 10 children, 6 of them survived, including in July of 1678 a son, Joseph, and in October of 1685 a second son, Charles. Watch what those 2 births do to Maria Antonia's life. At 4 years old, she is the emperor's only surviving child and the heiress of Spain. At 9, she has a baby half-brother who displaces her in Austria entirely. At 16, she has a second half-brother, and her father has started thinking seriously about which of his sons ought to be sent to Madrid. The Spanish claim ran through her mother's blood. It did not run through Eleanor Magdalene of Neuburg, who was a German princess with no Spanish connection worth the name. Leopold's own claim was weak, and he knew it was weak. The only route by which an Austrian Habsburg could take the Spanish throne went directly through his dead first wife, and therefore through his daughter. And there was no way around that fact. So he needed her claim without needing her. Before we get to how he arranged that, 2 other things came through Vienna while she was growing up. She lived through both, and they shaped the city around her. The first was the plague. In 1679, bubonic plague arrived in Vienna and did what bubonic plague does. Estimates of the death toll vary wildly, from 12,000 up to 70 or 80,000 depending on whose figures you take and whether you count the surrounding countryside. But whatever the true number, it gutted the city. Bodies were carted out to pits beyond the walls. Whole streets were sealed. The disease produced buboes in the groin and armpits, swellings the size of eggs that turned black and split, and the smell of the sick rooms was described by survivors as unbearable. A folk song about a bagpiper who fell into a plague pit drunk and climbed out alive came out of that outbreak, and Viennese children still sing it. The imperial family got out. They went to Prague, and then further, and they stayed away for months while the city died behind them. Maria Antonia was 10 years old. She would have understood exactly what was happening and exactly why they were leaving, and she would have known that the servants and the townspeople staying behind were not being offered the same option. Leopold put up a plague column on the Graben afterwards, and it's still standing. a huge, writhing Baroque monument of clouds and angels, with the emperor himself kneeling at the base. If you've been to Vienna, you've walked past it. It commemorates the deliverance of the city, phrasing chosen by people who had left. The disposal of the dead during that outbreak did not make it onto the column. Vienna could not bury that many people properly and did not try. Corpses were collected by carts, often by men who were themselves condemned criminals working for a pardon, and taken to pits outside the walls where they were tipped in layers with quicklime between them. Some accounts describe the carts running at night to reduce panic. Bodies were pulled out of houses where whole families had died together, and nobody had noticed for days in summer in a city with no drainage worth the name. In 1679, when Maria Antonia was 10, that was happening a few miles from wherever the imperial family was sleeping, and it went on for the better part of a year. 4 years later, the Ottomans arrived. The siege of Vienna in 1683 is one of the enormous events of the century, and Maria Antonia was 14 years old when it happened. An Ottoman army under Kara Mustafa Pasha, 150,000 strong or thereabouts, came up the Danube and sat down around the city in July. The imperial family fled again, first to Linz, then to Passau, while the garrison and the citizens held the walls. The siege lasted 2 months, and it was appalling. The Ottomans mined under the fortifications and blew sections of them apart. The defenders countermined. Fighting happened underground, in tunnels, in the dark, with pistols and shovels. Inside the city, food ran down to the point where people ate cats, and, by some accounts, worse. Dysentery went through the garrison. The wounded were laid out in churches. By September, the walls were breached in multiple places, and the defenders were down to a few thousand effective men. The relief came on the 12th of September, down off the Kahlenberg, with a Polish-German army and the largest cavalry charge anybody had ever seen. The Ottoman camp broke. Kara Mustafa was strangled with a silk cord on the Sultan's orders a few months later in Belgrade, and his head was sent to Istanbul in a velvet bag. What the imperial family came back to was not a victorious city so much as a wrecked one. The suburbs outside the walls had been burned deliberately by the defenders before the siege to deny the enemy cover, so thousands of Viennese had already lost everything before the first shot. The ground outside the fortifications was churned into trenchworks and mine craters and full of the unburied. Disease was working through the survivors, as it always did after a siege, and it went on killing people for months after the fighting stopped. Prisoners taken during the campaign were paraded. Ottoman captives were distributed as servants and curiosities among noble households across Austria and Germany, and a number of them ended up in Bavaria, in the household of the young elector who had ridden in with the relief force. And in among the casualties in the city, according to the accounts, was Maria Antonia's music teacher. So that is what survives of her adolescence. A 14-year-old evacuated upriver, waiting in Passau for news, and the news that eventually came back included the fact that the man who taught her music was dead in the wreckage of the city. Underneath all the dynastic maneuvering, she was a person having days, and the sources give us a little of what those days held. Leopold's Vienna was, more than anything else, a musical court. He is one of the few reigning monarchs in European history who could actually compose at a level his court chapel had no need to flatter. He wrote sacred music, chamber pieces, sections of operas, and a substantial body of it survives and gets performed. He employed people like Johann Heinrich Schmelzer, Alessandro Poglietti, Johann Caspar Kerl, Antonio Bertali, and later Johann Joseph Fuchs. Opera was staged constantly. The court establishment for musicians was one of the largest in Europe, and he protected the budget for it even when the treasury was screaming. Maria Antonia grew up inside that, and she took to it. She's recorded as a significant figure in the musical culture of the Viennese court, a patron and an active participant, as well as an audience. And the fact that the death of her music teacher in the siege registered in the record at all suggests the relationship was known and mattered to people around her. A childhood takes shape out of that. Long mornings of instruction, in languages, in religion, in music. Spanish spoken in the household because of her mother's establishment, German at court, Italian for the opera, Latin for the church. Court etiquette drilled into her from the moment she could stand. Because Vienna had inherited a version of Spanish ceremonial and applied it with Germanic thoroughness. Mass daily, and more than daily on feast days, in a court where her father's piety set the tone, and nobody was going to be seen falling short of it. And an emperor for a father who seems, on the evidence, to have genuinely liked her. At least, that is the impression I come away with. Leopold was an awkward, formal man, dutiful to the point of self-punishment, and he made political decisions about his children with a coldness that is hard to look at. But he kept her close. He brought her into the part of court life he cared about most. She wrote to him for the rest of her life, from Bavaria, constantly, and the correspondence was clearly the thing she reached for when the marriage went wrong. When she wanted somewhere to give birth away from her husband, she came to him. Both of those things are true simultaneously. He was the person she trusted most in the world, and he was the person who took her inheritance off her at 16. I don't think he saw a contradiction there. He would have understood himself to be doing his duty to the dynasty, which outranked his daughter, and he would have expected her to understand it the same way. By the mid-1680s, she was of an age where she was going to be married to someone, and the candidates had been circulating for years. Charles II himself, in that unexecuted contract of 1676. Victor Amadeus of Savoy had been floated at one point. What Leopold needed was a husband who brought military weight to the empire's western flank, because Louis XIV was the standing problem, and the empire needed the German princes bound to it. The man who distinguished himself in the relief of Vienna, riding in with the imperial forces at the age of 21, was Maximilian II Emanuel, Elector of Bavaria. 2 years later, Leopold married his daughter to him. The mechanism for stripping her of Spain was the renunciation, and it was drawn up in 1685, when she was 16 years old and about to be handed to Bavaria. Archduchesses signed renunciations routinely. That part was completely standard. You gave up your rights in your father's hereditary territories in favor of your male relatives, and in exchange you got a husband, a dowry, a household, and a position. Nobody in Europe found that shocking or unusual. It was the price of admission to adult royal life for every princess on the continent. What made this particular arrangement different was the second document. She signed two, one covering her rights in the Austrian lands, which was ordinary and expected, and nobody would have blinked at it, and one covering her rights to the Spanish monarchy, which was an entirely different animal, because those rights had not come from her father and were not his to bargain with. They came out of Madrid, through her mother, under Castilian law, and no Holy Roman Emperor in Vienna had the slightest jurisdiction over them. The act is dated the 5th of May, 1685. The original document sits in the Haus-, Hof- und Staatsarchiv in Vienna, catalogued and available to anybody who wants to go and look at it. She did manage to get something into it, a reversion clause. If every male line of the family died out, everything came back to her and her descendants. She was 16 years old, being coerced into signing away the largest empire in the world, and she found a way to leave a door open at the far end of the corridor. I like her enormously for that. The circumstances of the signing are where it stops being procedural. Her father made the marriage conditional on it. Permission to marry was withheld until the signature was on the paper. Whether she wanted the marriage for its own sake or simply wanted out of a household where her position had been shrinking every year since her half-brothers were born, either way, the only exit available required her to sign. Leopold was also negotiating privately on the other side. Maximilian Emmanuel was promised the governorship of the Spanish Netherlands, which was a substantial and lucrative post. Beyond that, a secret treaty guaranteed him the Netherlands outright should he or his sons ever end up in possession of Spain. So while the bride was being pressured into surrendering an empire, the groom was being quietly paid a commission out of it. 16 years old, signing a document she almost certainly understood perfectly well, with a wedding as the incentive. Madrid's response to all of this changes the whole story. Spain never accepted it. Not once, not in any form, not for a single day. The Spanish position was direct. Succession to the Spanish crown is governed by Spanish law, and a renunciation executed in Vienna, without the consent of the King of Spain and without the Cortes, has no legal force. The Council of State went through the text and concluded it altered nothing whatsoever. Leopold pushed hard on this because he understood the problem. He wanted Charles II to ratify the renunciation, to put his own signature to something acknowledging it, because without Spanish confirmation the paper in the Vienna archive was decorative. Charles refused. In a letter dated the 11th of March, 1687, written in Italian, he declined to ratify and laid out his reasons in detail, going point by point through why Maria Antonia remained, beyond any argument, his heiress. That letter survives in the Harrach family archive in Vienna, a slightly delicious detail given that the Harrachs were Leopold's own ambassadors. The legal argument underneath all of this is the whole reason her claim would not die. Castilian succession law, going back to the medieval code known as the Siete Partidas, worked on representation and proximity rather than strict male preference. Sons came before daughters within the same rank, yes, but a daughter of the previous king outranked a distant male cousin, and crucially, the descendants of a deceased child stepped into that child's place in the queue. Spain had had reigning queens. Isabella of Castile is not a footnote in Spanish history, so the queue after Charles II, worked out honestly, went like this. His elder sister Maria Theresa and her line, unless the renunciation held, and the French argued it did not hold because the dowry was never paid. His younger sister Margaret Theresa and her line, and Philip IV's own will had explicitly protected her position. Only after that did you get to more remote branches. Margaret Theresa was dead. Her line consisted of exactly one person, and Spanish law had nothing to say about renunciations executed abroad by an emperor in Vienna, because the crown of Castile was not property that a foreign relative could sign away on a woman's behalf. The Cortes had a role. The king had a role. A document produced in the Habsburg had neither. That is why Charles refused to ratify. Sentiment about his niece had little to do with it. He was defending the principle that his succession was his own business and not Leopold's, and he understood perfectly well that the moment he signed something acknowledging the Vienna renunciation, he was conceding that Austrian emperors could rearrange the Spanish throne by correspondence. Think about where that leaves her. Her father has forced her signature onto a document stripping her of an empire. The actual ruler of that empire has written, in his own hand, to say the document is meaningless and she remains his heir. And she is by then in Munich, married in her late teens, with absolutely no power to act on either fact. The two most powerful men in her life were conducting a legal argument about her body's inheritance in Latin and Italian across 1,000 miles, and neither of them was going to ask her opinion about it. The marriage itself took place in Vienna on the 15th of July, 1685. She was 16. Maximilian II Emmanuel, Elector of Bavaria, was 23 and had held his title since he was 17. The wedding turned into a diplomatic knife fight before anybody got near the vows, and the fight was about who stood where. The Spanish ambassador, the Marquis of Bergamain, got into a precedence dispute with the papal nuncio and the Venetian ambassador, so vicious that the nuncio threatened to refuse to conduct the ceremony altogether. Grown men arguing over the placement of chairs while a 16-year-old waited to be married off. Max Emanuel needs an introduction here. He is a magnificent specimen of a particular type of late 17th century prince. Born in Munich in July of 1662, Elector at 17 on the death of his father, personally brave to the point of recklessness which he demonstrated at Vienna in 1683, and then far more spectacularly at Belgrade in 1688. Where he stormed the fortress with Serbian insurgent forces alongside him under Jovan Monasterlia, and made his reputation across Europe overnight. He was the sort of commander who wanted to be physically in the assault, who liked the noise of it, and who understood perfectly how much a reputation for courage was worth in the diplomatic market. He was also extravagant on a scale that eventually helped bankrupt Bavaria. He built the Munich residence, which he extended and decorated at enormous expense. Schleißheim, where he commissioned an entire new palace on a scale that would have embarrassed a much larger state. The beginnings of Nymphenburg. Gardens, canals, orangeries, hunting lodges, festivals, fireworks, whole architectural programs designed to say that the Elector of Bavaria was the equal of anybody in Europe. Bavarian peasants paid for all of it in taxes, and there were revolts about it later. And he was, by absolutely universal contemporary agreement, a womanizer who made no effort at all to be discreet about it. His wife was, in almost every measurable respect, his opposite. The Neue Deutsche Biographie, about as sober and unsentimental as German reference scholarship gets, describes her as having been from childhood quiet and reserved. No beauty, the entry says, but distinctive, serious, devout, musical, happier in a small room with a few people than in a hall with 300. Put those two into a palace together and you can more or less draw the next 7 years without opening another document. She arrived in Munich as a foreigner and she remained one. The Bavarian court had its own long-established families and its own hierarchies and its own ways of doing things, and she came in with an Austrian-Spanish household, an Austrian-Spanish sense of ceremony, and a husband who was very frequently somewhere else. He campaigned almost continuously through those years, on the Danube, in Hungary, on the Rhine, against the Ottomans, and then against the French. When he was in Munich, he was building or hunting or staging festivals or conducting affairs that everybody in the palace knew about. The German accounts describe her as being largely left to her own devices, supervised by her chief lady-in-waiting, and given very little attention by the man she had married. One German popular history states it about as plainly as it can be stated. He barely noticed her, and she pulled further into her devotions and her music and her correspondence with her father, who by every appearance remained the person she was closest to for the whole of her life. Munich in the 1680s was not a small provincial town. To be fair to it, the residence was one of the larger palaces in Germany, the court was expensively dressed, Italian opera was performed, French dancing masters were on the payroll, but Munich was not Vienna, and more to the point it was not her father's house, and she seems never to have built a life there that belonged to her. The specific shape of that isolation was undramatic. Nobody locked her in a tower. She had rooms, servants, money, jewels, a title, and a household. What she did not have was any function. An electress at a court like that has one job in the eyes of everybody around her, and it is to produce an heir. Everything else she does is decoration. She is not consulted on policy. She does not sit in council. Her husband is either at war or building or hunting, and when he is at court, he is surrounded by his own people, men he campaigned with, and the atmosphere of that circle would have been loud and physical and entirely uninterested in a quiet, devout foreign woman who preferred chamber music. Her days would have been structured around the chapel and her own apartments, mass in the morning, devotions, correspondence, which for her meant Vienna, Music, which we know she cared about, and which was probably the one part of Munich life she could actually inhabit. Meals conducted with ceremony in front of people, and then the long stretches with the Elector away on campaign for months at a stretch, which by all accounts she found preferable to the alternative. The Bavarian court knew about the mistresses, and their knowing turned a private unhappiness into a daily public condition. Everybody in those rooms knew, and she knew they knew, and the etiquette required her to conduct herself as though nothing was happening, at dinner, in chapel, at every ceremonial appearance, for years. She was between 16 and 23 for the entire duration of this, and then she got pregnant, and the machinery that killed her mother started running again. 22nd of May, 1689. A son, Leopold Ferdinand. He lived 2 days. 19th of November, 1690. A son, Anton. He died at birth. 2 sons, 18 months apart, both gone almost immediately. She was 21 years old, and she had buried 2 children, and she was in a foreign court with a husband who was rarely present, and whose attention was elsewhere when he was. 2 days, and then nothing at all. Numbers like that slide past very fast on their own. An infant who lives 2 days and then dies has usually died of one of a small handful of things. Sepsis contracted during the delivery, coming up the same route the mother's infection would take. A congenital heart or lung defect that the circulation could not compensate for once the umbilical supply was cut. Bleeding from a vitamin deficiency nobody understood until the 20th century, or a birth injury from a difficult delivery with hands or instruments involved. Whatever it was, it happened in a room over about 48 hours, with a 19-year-old mother in the bed a few feet away who had just been through the delivery and who was being told at intervals how the child was doing. Royal infants were not kept with their mothers. The baby went to a wet nurse and a nursery establishment almost immediately, which meant that in many cases a royal mother saw her own newborn for scheduled visits rather than continuously. So the reports would have been brought to her. Somebody would have come through the door with news about how the feeding was going and whether the colour had improved, and then at some point somebody came through the door with different news. The second one, Anton, did not survive the birth at all. She went through the entire labour, hours of it, possibly a day of it, and produced a dead child at the end. In 1690, that outcome carried an additional layer of horror that we have mostly forgotten. A baby who died before baptism could not be buried in consecrated ground and, under the theology of the period as most people understood it, could not enter heaven. Priests attended difficult births, specifically to baptize a struggling infant in the first seconds, if there was any chance at all. Sometimes they baptized a hand or a foot before the rest of the body had come out. Whether Anton got that, the record does not tell us. So by the age of 21 she had been through it twice, and both times the thing she had been physically wrecked in order to produce was taken out of the room and put in a box. Saying she lost 2 infants flattens what those deliveries physically involved, so here is the longer version. Childbirth in a 17th century palace was, in certain measurable respects, more dangerous than childbirth in a village. And that sounds absurd until you look at why. The village woman had a midwife, experienced, usually old, with hands that had been doing nothing else all week, and a working knowledge of what a difficult presentation looked like. The princess had physicians, university men, trained in Galen and Hippocrates, who had spent that morning doing something else entirely, possibly an autopsy, and who regarded the cleanliness of their hands as completely irrelevant to the outcome, because the theory of disease they operated under had nothing whatsoever to do with contamination. Germ theory was 150 years in the future. Ignaz Semmelweis would not work out that doctors were carrying death on their fingers from the dissection room to the delivery room until the 1840s in a hospital in this same city. So the birth chamber was crowded and hot and shut up tight. Fresh air was believed to be dangerous to a laboring woman, so the windows stayed closed and in some cases the keyholes were stopped with cloth. Fires burned regardless of the season. Physicians and attendants and ladies came and went through the door. If the labor stalled, hands went in. Unwashed hands, to turn a child that was lying wrong, or to bring away a placenta that hadn't come free on its own, and every single one of those interventions dragged whatever happened to be living on those hands directly into an open uterus. The instruments available were limited and horrifying. Forceps existed but were a closely guarded family secret in England and not in general use. What was in general use when a child was stuck and the mother was going to die were hooks and perforators, and I'll say plainly what those were for. If the baby could not be delivered and the mother might still be saved, the child's skull was pierced and collapsed and the body extracted in pieces. Craniotomy. It was a recognized procedure with a name and a set of tools, and it was performed with the mother conscious. If something went wrong afterward, the treatments were bleeding, purging, blistering, mercury, opium, alum, turpentine. Every one of those is either useless against infection or actively accelerates the collapse. And after any birth, successful or not, the inside of the uterus is a raw wound. The placenta detaches and leaves behind a surface roughly the size of a dinner plate, with open blood vessels feeding directly into the general circulation. For days afterward, that surface is a doorway standing open. Anything that gets into it gets into everything. She survived both of those births, twice. At 20 and at 21, in that room, with those men and those hands. Then, in the closing months of 1691, something shifted in the marriage, and she clearly understood it as final. Max Emmanuel was appointed governor of the Spanish Netherlands, the post that had been part of the original bargain her father struck in 1685. He went to Brussels, and he took his mistress with him. The identity of that woman is one of the real tangles in the sources. English language accounts sometimes give a Countess Canosa. The name that appears far more consistently in the Bavarian material covering his Netherlands years is Agnes Françoise Lelouchier, a Walloon woman he took up with after arriving, who bore him a son in 1695, a boy who was later given the title Chevalier de Bavière, and who was eventually married off to a Count Arco to make the situation respectable. Some tellings attach a Countess von Lamberg to him, but that name belongs properly to a different woman entirely, the mistress of Augustus of Poland, and it looks very much like two similar stories got welded together somewhere along the line, and the join never got noticed. What is not in any doubt is that he departed for Brussels with a mistress, and that his pregnant wife did not go with him. She went to Vienna instead, to her father. That decision is the loudest thing Maria Antonia ever did, and I don't think it gets enough attention. She was carrying a child who, if it turned out to be a boy, would be a serious candidate for the throne of Spain. Her husband wanted that child born in Munich, on Bavarian soil, in front of Bavarian witnesses, for reasons that are completely obvious. She overrode him and travelled across the Alps in the later stages of a pregnancy, and gave birth in her father's house. Contemporaries assumed she had no intention of coming back, and I don't think they were guessing. Her son was born in the Hofburg on the 28th of October, 1692. Joseph Ferdinand Leopold of Bavaria, named for her half-brother, her husband, and her father, in that order, itself a small piece of deliberate diplomacy on somebody's part. He was healthy. After Leopold Ferdinand and after Anton, after her mother's 4 dead babies and 2 lost pregnancies, after the entire grinding history of this family's nurseries, a boy who lived. The couriers went out from Vienna within hours, because every chancery in Europe needed to know immediately. A living son of Maria Antonia changed the entire calculation of the Spanish succession overnight. Charles II was 31 and visibly failing. The 2 great claims, French and Austrian, both meant war. And here, in a cradle in the Hofburg, was a boy with a legitimate Spanish claim through Margaret Theresa, belonging to neither France nor Austria, whose accession nobody would have to fight over. Madrid understood it faster than anyone. The Spanish envoy in Vienna was writing home about the child within days. Councillors in Spain who had spent 30 years watching their empire's future narrow to a single childless man could now see a possible way out that did not involve foreign armies in Castile. So Maria Antonia, at 23, lying in a bed in her father's palace, had just done the single most politically consequential thing that any Habsburg woman did in that generation. She had produced the compromise. Every treaty negotiated over the next 6 years would be built around the boy she had just delivered. She would not live long enough to find any of that out. What the 8 weeks actually contained, we can partly reconstruct from the fact of the season and the household. The Hofburg at the end of October would be cold and getting colder. Her rooms would be heated with stoves and closed up, since a woman in childbed was to be protected from air. She would have been expected to lie in for a month at minimum, receiving visitors in a formal sequence, with the baby brought in and taken away again by the nursery establishment. Advent started at the end of November, and Leopold's Vienna took Advent seriously. Fasting, long services, the court's musicians turning toward the Christmas repertoire, which in that palace meant a substantial amount of new composition and rehearsal happening in rooms not far from hers. And through it, the fever, coming and going, physicians in and out. Her father, who was in the same building, would have been getting reports daily and visiting when protocol and her condition allowed. Somewhere in there, in a room with the stove burning and the household preparing for Christmas around her, she gave instructions for her will. Somebody had told her, or she had worked it out for herself, that she was not going to recover. She had 8 weeks left. Here is where the record thins out in precisely the places you most want it thick. And I'll give you what actually exists rather than filling the gap with invention. The German biographical tradition, working from Ludwig Hüttel's scholarship on Max Emanuel, says that she recovered from the birth only with difficulty, that she fell into a melancholia, and that she died on Christmas Eve. Melancholia in 1692 covers an enormous amount of ground. It could be describing grief. It could be describing what we would now call postpartum depression in a woman who had already buried 2 infants and was living in her father's house because her marriage had ended in everything but name. It could equally be describing the early phase of a septic illness, because the confusion and lethargy and withdrawal that come with an infection spreading through the body look, from the outside of a curtained bed, exactly like a woman who has gone quiet. What killed her was almost certainly puerperal fever, childbed fever. The single largest killer of European women in that century, ahead of every war being fought across the continent at the time. Saying she died shortly after childbirth tells you nothing at all about what those 8 weeks contained. The mechanics of it are horrible. Bacteria get into the uterus during or shortly after delivery. Streptococcus, most commonly, carried in on hands or on instruments or on linen. They settle into the open placental site, a perfect environment for them, warm, wet, protein-rich, and connected to the bloodstream. From the lining they work outward into the muscular wall of the uterus itself. The uterus, which in a healthy recovery should be contracting down hard and firming up day by day, instead stays soft and swollen and boggy, and it begins to smell. The lochia, the normal discharge after a birth, turns foul. That smell was the classic diagnostic sign, and every midwife in Europe knew it and recognized it instantly. And knowing it helped precisely nobody, because there was nothing on earth in 1692 that could be done about it. From the uterus, the infection travels outward into the fallopian tubes and the surrounding pelvic tissue, and then it breaches into the abdominal cavity. Peritonitis. The abdomen distends and goes rigid and becomes so exquisitely tender that the weight of a bedsheet is unbearable. Patients in that state lie absolutely still with their knees drawn up because any movement of the abdominal wall is agony. The fever runs high and it is punctuated by rigors. A rigor is not shivering. It is a violent, uncontrollable, whole-body shaking that a person cannot suppress, teeth chattering hard enough to chip, the entire frame convulsing under blankets while the skin burns to the touch, pulse racing and thin. Then the bacteria get into the bloodstream itself and it stops being a local problem at all. Septicemia. Organ systems begin failing in sequence. Some women developed secondary abscesses in the joints, in the lungs, in the brain. The treatment on offer was bleeding, which drains a circulation that is already collapsing. Purging, which dehydrates a patient who is losing fluid into her own abdominal cavity by the pint. blistering, which means deliberately burning the skin to raise weeping sores on the belief that corruption will drain out through them. Opium, if she was fortunate, which at least put some distance between her and the pain. 8 weeks is a long course for fulminant streptococcal sepsis, which usually kills in days. The length suggests something slower and grinding rather than one overwhelming assault. A pelvic abscess, perhaps, walled off by the body and seeding into the blood in waves. That produces days of fever followed by days of apparent improvement, alternating over and over. Her sitting up and taking food and looking better, and the whole household letting out a breath. And then the shaking starting again in the night. Through the whole of it, physicians would have been coming into the room and opening her veins. She died on the 24th of December, 1692. The time is recorded on her coffin, 5:30 in the morning. Christmas Eve, in the dark, in the Hofburg, in the same complex of rooms where her mother had died 19 years earlier at almost precisely the same age, 23 years old. Before she died, she made a will, and that will is the most revealing document she ever produced. She renounced the Spanish monarchy again, for herself and her heirs, formally, in her own testament, in her own name this time, rather than under her father's hand. You can take that as a straightforward capitulation, a dying woman finally giving in to 7 years of pressure. You can equally take it as a woman making certain the claim passed cleanly down to her infant son rather than getting snarled up in litigation over her own contested rights. Given what else is in the document, I lean towards the second, because the rest of the will is a knife. She disinherited her husband completely. Every piece of private property she controlled went to the baby, Joseph Ferdinand, and if the baby died, it went to her father, the emperor. Maximilian Emmanuel, Elector of Bavaria, governor of the Spanish Netherlands, the hero of Belgrade, received nothing at all from a wife he had spent 7 years failing to look at. She died on Christmas Eve, and they buried her the following day, on Christmas Day. What happens to a Habsburg body after death is a process, and hers went through the whole of it. The corpse was opened, standard practice, required both for the embalming and for the medical examination that Habsburg custom demanded on every member of the family. The abdominal and thoracic cavities were cut and the internal organs were removed. The heart was taken out separately and deliberately, and handled on its own, washed and placed in its own vessel. The remaining viscera, the intestines and the stomach and the lungs and the rest, went into a copper container. The emptied cavity was washed out and packed with aromatic herbs and preservative compounds, resins and salts and quicklime, then sewn shut with heavy thread. The face was cleaned, the hair arranged, the body dressed in the clothing chosen for it. None of this was done quickly or quietly. Embalmers worked in a room in the palace with the organs in basins beside them in December, and the whole household knew it was happening. 3 separate churches then received 3 separate parts of her. The body went to the Capuchin church on the Neue Markt, into the imperial crypt, into the Leopold vault that her father had built to hold his own family. Position number 28. The heart went into an urn in the Herzgruft, the heart crypt, in a small chamber beneath the Loreto chapel of the Augustinian church. A few minutes' walk away, where a wall of silver vessels holds the hearts of the dynasty, each labelled, stacked in rows behind a grill. Hers is urn number 8. The viscera went, following the established custom, to the ducal crypt underneath St. Stephen's Cathedral, where the organs of the family sit in copper containers in the dark under the choir. 41 members of this family received the full 3-way division. The practice had been formalized with King Ferdinand IV in 1654, whose heart was placed at the feet of the Madonna in the Loreto Chapel in July of that year, and Leopold picked it up and made it systematic and enlarged the Capuchin crypt to accommodate what had become, by his reign, an industrial volume of dead relatives. So she is in 3 separate buildings in Vienna right now, today, body in one, heart in another, everything else in a third. If you go to the city, you can walk between all 3 locations in under half an hour, and thousands of people do it every week without any idea that the same 23-year-old is underneath all 3 of them. One detail about the burial is specifically hers, and she asked for it. Her recorded wish was to be laid beside her mother, and she was. Margaret Theresa had gone down into the Leopold vault in 1673 with a 4-month-old son still inside her, and 19 years later her daughter was carried down the same steps and set next to her, having died of the same profession at almost exactly the same age. The 2 of them have been lying there together ever since, 330-odd years. The place they're in has kept filling up around them, which does something strange to how you experience it if you go down there now. The imperial crypt has been the family's burial place since 1617, when Anna of Tyrol left instructions and money for it, and the first burials happened in 1633. It now holds something in the region of 150 people, 12 emperors, 18 empresses, archdukes and archduchesses, and infants and stillbirths, going forward in a continuous line for 400 years to Empress Zita in 1989 and beyond. It's arranged in chambers, each one added as the previous one filled, so walking through it is a walk forward in time. The early vaults are plain. Then Leopold's generation arrives and the sarcophagi start growing decoration. Then the 18th century turns up and the whole thing goes berserk, with Maria Theresa and her husband in a double sarcophagus the size of a small car, covered in figures, with the 2 of them sculpted on top, sitting up and looking at each other. And down at the far end sits Joseph II in a plain copper box, because he thought the rest of it was vulgar, a very Joseph II thing to have done. Maria Antonia is in the earlier part, in her father's vault, in a room where the decoration is still restrained. Small box, steep lid, skull under a crucifix, and her mother beside her in the pewter, with a son inside her that nobody living ever saw. The Capuchin friars have been maintaining all of it, continuously, since the 1600s. Friars are still living above it now. Somebody has been keeping that room clean for 4 centuries. The coffin was made by Thomas Koch of Munich, in pewter, and the strange steep ridge of the lid is his design choice, or somebody's, and it makes her box stand out immediately in a room full of rounded Baroque sarcophagi. The monogram on the side, those 4 letters, stands for Maria Anna, Electress in Bavaria. The crucifix runs the length of the lid, and the skull and crossed bones sit beneath it. The Latin line calls her a princess most illustrious in birth, in marriage, in childbearing and in death, and notes that she died 2 months after delivering her child. Since we're down in that crypt, one more thing about the Capuchin vault, and it's something that gets repeated everywhere. If you've heard anything at all about Habsburg funerals, you've heard about the knocking ceremony, the Anklopf ceremony. A coffin arrives at the door of the crypt in procession. A court official strikes the door 3 times with a staff. A voice from inside asks who desires entry. The full titles are recited, every one of them, Emperor of this and Apostolic King of that and Duke of the other, a list that can run for a minute or more. And the voice from within says, "We do not know him." The staff strikes again, a shorter list of honors and virtues rather than territories. "We do not know him." The staff strikes a 3rd time, and this time the answer is that a mortal, sinful man asks to be let in, and the door opens. It is a beautiful piece of ritual, genuinely one of the finest bits of theatre any European dynasty ever came up with, and it is featured in about 100 novels. The complication is that the Capuchins themselves say no written Habsburg burial record describes it. The documented performance of it, with that spoken exchange in that form, dates to the funeral of the Empress Zita in 1989, who wanted a knocking ceremony conducted as though it were ancient practice. Earlier fragments exist. Titles were certainly recited before the crypt at various imperial funerals, including that of Joseph II, and the general idea of humbling the dead at the threshold is old. But the specific script, the 3 strikes and the 3 refusals, is not something anybody can put into the mouths of the men who carried Maria Antonia's coffin down those stairs on Christmas Day, 1692. So the funeral she actually received was quieter and less cinematic than the one that circulates. A 23-year-old woman in a pewter box in the middle of the Christmas season, in a vault where her mother had been waiting for 19 years. Reactions came in from across Europe, and the one that arrived from Madrid is the one that stays with me. The Council of State met on the 29th of January 1693, and the consulta they produced records inconsolable pain. Their phrasing describes her as the only thing left in this world from the Empress Margarita. These are hardened Spanish councillors, professionally cynical men whose entire working lives were spent calculating advantage. And what they put down on paper was that the last piece of Margaret Theresa was gone. Charles II, by this point deep into his own decline, ordered that her funeral honours match those given to princesses of Spain, without exceeding them. That's protocol doing exactly what protocol does. But he also gave his envoy in Vienna specific instructions on the order of business, and the order he specified was this: deliver the condolences on her death first, and only afterwards deliver the congratulations on the birth of her son. The birth had happened 2 months before the death. Standard diplomatic practice would have handled the joyful news first as the earlier event. He deliberately inverted it. Whatever else Charles II was, and he was a great many unfortunate things, he understood that a woman had died, and that this was not the moment to open with good news about a baby. Her husband's reaction can be summarized more briskly. Within about 2 years, he was in negotiations for a second marriage, And in 1694 he married Theresa Kunigunda Sobieska, daughter of the King of Poland, with a dowry of 500,000 thalers. That marriage collapsed too, eventually, and it collapsed when the second wife found his love letters to Agnes Lelouchia, by then the Countess Arco, and walked out. She spent the rest of her life in Venice and never went back to him. Her father, Leopold, who had now buried 3 wives and a great many children, and this daughter, went back to work. He had a war running against France, and another one against the Ottomans, and a Spanish succession to arrange and a treasury to keep from collapsing. What he felt about the death of his eldest child at 5:30 on Christmas Eve morning does not appear in the diary in any form I have been able to find, which may mean nothing at all. He was 52 years old, and by 1692 the deaths had rather stacked up on him. And now the last part of this, where the girl who was forced to sign away an empire gets a very strange answer from history. Her son, Joseph Ferdinand, was 8 weeks old when she died. He was taken to Bavaria and raised there, and then to Brussels, where his father was governing, and he grew up healthy, which in this family already qualified as extraordinary. Through the middle of the 1690s, Charles II was visibly failing, and the succession question had turned into the single most dangerous problem in Europe. 2 great powers held claims. France, through Louis XIV's marriage to Maria Theresa, whose renunciation had never been paid for, and therefore, in French eyes, had never taken effect. Austria, through Leopold's own descent, and through the renunciation he had extracted from his daughter, which he intended to convert into a claim for his younger son, Archduke Charles. Neither claim could win without a general European war, because neither France nor Austria was going to sit still and watch the other absorb Spain and its empire. The balance of the continent would have been finished. Every diplomat in Europe understood this and had understood it for 30 years. So a third option had to exist. And the third option was a small boy. Joseph Ferdinand of Bavaria was a great-grandson of Philip IV, descended through Margaret Theresa, whose rights had been explicitly protected in Philip's own will. He was Bavarian, which meant that putting him on the Spanish throne would hand Spain to neither France nor Austria. He was, from the point of view of everybody who did not want a continental war, the perfect answer. Britannica's assessment of the 3 claims puts it about as plainly as it can be put. The validity of what Leopold had extracted was dubious. The French claim was equally dubious, and the claim of the Bavarian electoral prince appeared superior to both of them. In 1698, France and England and the Dutch Republic signed a partition treaty at The Hague, agreeing to divide the Spanish inheritance among the interested parties. The boy would get Spain itself, the Spanish Netherlands, and the Indies. The French Dauphin would take Naples and Sicily and a slice of the Basque country. Archduke Charles would take Milan. Charles II found out about it and by every account went into a fury. Foreign powers carving up his empire over his head while he was still alive and still on the throne was intolerable to him, and his response was to write a will that made partition impossible. On the 14th of November, 1698, Charles II of Spain named Joseph Ferdinand of Bavaria universal heir to the entire undivided Spanish monarchy. All of it. Spain, the Netherlands, the Italian territories, the Americas, the Philippines, to a 6-year-old boy living in Brussels. Maria Antonia had been dead for 6 years. She had signed 2 documents renouncing precisely this. Madrid had never accepted either of them, and the claim had travelled straight through her, exactly as Spanish law had always said it would, and landed on her son. Whatever her father thought he had purchased in 1685, this was not it. Joseph Ferdinand was the future King of Spain for 11 weeks. He died on the 6th of February 1699 in Brussels. He was 6 years old. The cause is given differently depending on where you look. Smallpox is the most common attribution and the most probable, given what smallpox did to European children in that century. Some accounts say typhoid. One German account describes a malignant inflammation of the stomach. A popular telling describes seizures, vomiting, and prolonged unconsciousness, though I have not been able to trace that particular description back to anything I would call a solid source, and it may well be somebody's reconstruction. Smallpox in a small child is a specific and terrible thing. Fever first, and headache, and a violent aching in the back. Then the rash, starting on the face and forearms, spreading inward. The lesions fill with fluid, then with pus, and in the worst presentations they run together into sheets so that the skin comes away from the flesh underneath in layers. The child cannot open his eyes because the lids are crusted shut. The mouth and throat are covered in the same lesions, so swallowing is agony and breathing becomes difficult. It takes about 2 weeks from first fever to death, and the moment he died, Europe began saying he had been poisoned. The rumors ran in every available direction. Some pointed at France. Some pointed at Austria and specifically at his own grandfather Leopold, on the reasoning that a dead Bavarian boy cleared the path for Archduke Charles. Nobody proved anything, and nobody was ever going to prove anything. A 6-year-old dying of disease in 1699 was among the least surprising events available in the period, and simultaneously half the courts in Europe had a clear motive, and both of those things being true at the same time is exactly what makes a rumor like that impossible to kill. What is not in dispute is what followed. The compromise candidate was in a coffin. The one person whose accession would not trigger a general European war was dead. France and Austria were now facing each other directly across an empire with nothing standing between them. A second partition treaty was signed in 1700, this one handing Spain to Archduke Charles and the Italian territories to the French. Charles II rejected it as comprehensively as he had rejected the first. And in October of 1700, within weeks of his death, he signed a final will leaving everything, whole and undivided, to Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV. He died on the 1st of November 1700, and they carried him to the Escorial. Louis XIV accepted the will. Austria refused to accept it. England and the Dutch Republic looked at the prospect of France and Spain governed by one family and concluded they could not live in that world. The War of the Spanish Succession started the following year and ran until 1714, 13 years of it. Blenheim, Ramillies, Oudenarde, Malplaquet, where somewhere in the region of 30,000 men were killed or wounded in a single day, and survivors were still describing that field in memoirs decades afterwards. The wounded lying out overnight in the rain among the dead horses. Sieges across the Low Countries that starved out towns. Fighting in Italy, in Spain itself, in Germany, in the Americas. Treasuries wrecked in half the capitals of Europe. Somewhere between 250,000 and 500,000 dead, depending on how you count and whether you include disease, which you should, because disease killed far more of them than shot did. Max Emmanuel chose the French side, gambling that Louis would win and that he would come out of it with a crown. He lost Bavaria for it. His lands were occupied and taxed savagely by the Austrians. The Bavarian peasantry rose in revolt and were slaughtered, and he spent years in exile in the Netherlands and then in France, living on French subsidies and continuing to spend money he did not have. He got his territories back at the peace in 1714 and died in 1726 in his 60s, having outlived Maria Antonia by 34 years. Leopold died in 1705, in the middle of the war he had helped to cause. His son Joseph succeeded him and died of smallpox 6 years later. His other son, Archduke Charles, the boy whose future the Renunciation had been drafted to secure, ended up as Holy Roman Emperor and never did get Spain, and spent the rest of his life styling himself king of it anyway. Spain went to the Bourbons. The Bourbons are still there. One more thing before we get to the end of her, and it's about why you've never heard of her. She falls out of the story for structural reasons rather than because anybody suppressed her. The English language histories of the Spanish succession are mostly written as diplomatic and military history, and diplomatic history follows the men who signed things and the armies that moved. Maria Antonia signed one document under duress at 16 and then died. Her son gets a paragraph because a treaty was named after him. She gets a line, if that, usually as a transitional clause explaining where the Bavarian claim came from. The Spanish scholarship is different, and this is where it gets interesting. Work coming out of Spanish archives, particularly Rocio Martinez Lopez's research on the Council of State papers, has been pulling her back into focus over the last decade or so, and the view from the Madrid side is nothing like a footnote. From Madrid, she was the heiress continuously for 19 years, formally recognized, nationally celebrated, personally corresponded with, and defended in writing by the king himself against her own father's attempt to erase her rights. Two completely different women emerge depending on which archive you happen to be sitting in. The German scholarship gives you a third version again. Hüttel and the Neue Deutsche Biographie are interested in Bavaria, so what you get from them is the unhappy marriage, the melancholia, and the will that cut her husband out, which are the parts the Austrian and Spanish material barely touch. None of the three are wrong. They're just looking at different pieces of the same 23 years, and nobody until quite recently was putting the pieces on the same table. Which leaves us with the woman in the pewter box with the odd, steep lid. She was born into a family that had spent 2 centuries folding its own bloodline back onto itself, and she came out of that process carrying the heaviest measured burden of it that anybody in the dynasty ever carried. And by the standards of what happened to her relatives, she got away lightly. She could walk. She could speak, she could think clearly, She was musical and devout, and on the evidence of that reversion clause, sharp enough at 16 to insert a legal escape hatch into a document she was being coerced into signing. The genes did not finish her. The job did. Married at 16 to a man who barely acknowledged she was in the building. Pregnant 3 times in 7 years, 2 sons buried before either of them could focus their eyes on a face, a husband in Brussels with another woman while she carried the third, a journey across the Alps in the late stages of that pregnancy to get away from him and back to her father, a healthy son at last, in October, in the Hofburg. And then 8 weeks of fever with physicians opening her veins to let out an infection they had no name for and no concept of, while downstairs the court prepared for Christmas. 5:30 in the morning, the 24th of December, 1692. The bells for the Christmas services would have started a few hours after she stopped breathing. And the arrangement she was destroyed to serve did not even survive her by very long. Her son was dead inside 7 years. Her uncle was dead inside 8, and his autopsy sent a description of the inside of a Habsburg body out across Europe that people are still repeating. The Spanish branch of the family was finished. The Austrian branch limped on until 1740, when the male line ran out entirely, and Maria Theresa had to fight a war to keep her own inheritance. Sit that sentence next to what was done to Maria Antonia at 16 to guarantee exactly that situation never arose. 200 years of marrying uncles to nieces to keep everything inside the family, and everything went outside the family anyway, and all it cost was the nurseries. They carried her down the next day and set her beside her mother, and the 2 of them have been lying there together ever since, one of them still carrying the son they found on the table. Right, I'll leave it there. Thank you for sitting through a long one, and a proper thank you to everybody keeping this channel alive over on Patreon and through the YouTube memberships. Those links are down in the description and pinned at the top of the comments if you fancy joining. And if you know somebody from this period who ended up buried underneath the more famous names, stick them in the comments. Look after yourselves.